We're riding a night train to the end of the line, the Zimbabwean border.
Sorry.
These men fled the regime in Zimbabwe. Up until a few days ago, they were living illegally in neighboring South Africa. But the South Africans don't want them. They're shipping them straight back.
Only the situation in Zimbabwe is forcing us to be in. People are starving and people are suffering down the side. See? They are starving. It's painful. Just look at down.
Hands.
The guards yell for heads down. Hunched up like this, the guards told us, the men are less likely to jump. But that didn't stop over a dozen Zimbabweans from leaping off the train we were riding. They risked death rather than face the regime back home. Morning, and the border draws closer. People told us these were their last hours to speak freely.
You can't get the truth in Zimbabwe, no? No. Even if you get me in Zimbabwe, I can't tell you the truth. Because the time I tell you, there's some people of ZANU-PF watching me. When you go, they kill me.
By nightfall, these men will have been marched back into Zimbabwe. But we're not allowed to go with them. The Zimbabwean government has banned all foreign journalists. This great natural beauty is what Zimbabwe was once famous for. It's home to the Victoria Falls, one of the 7 wonders of the world. For us, the falls were our way in. We've come to Zimbabwe pretending to be tourists, to see for ourselves an increasingly repressive and secret state. This was once one of the most popular vacation spots in Africa. But we find our hotel eerily empty. Ten years ago, Zimbabwe was one of the richest countries in Africa. But now, runaway inflation tops 1,000%, and this money isn't worth the ink on the bills. We just changed our money, and thankfully they've issued a new note today, the $50,000 bill. When I said to the lady in the bank, this is rather a lot of money to be carrying around, she laughed and said it was nothing. It takes stacks of money, just for the basic necessities here. Once called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe was ruled by a white minority until 1980. But after a fierce war of independence, Robert Mugabe rose to power. A freedom fighter turned dictator, Mugabe has transformed Zimbabwe from the prize of Africa into a state of fear. We set off for Mugabe's seat of power, Harare. If we were caught reporting, we'd be arrested. We see a long line of cars at an empty gas station. People can wait here for weeks, we're told, for fuel that may never arrive. Down the road, we find another sign of the hardships we'd heard about. A garbage dump where people scavenge for food alongside baboons. These men told us they were surviving through luck alone. I asked who was to blame.
You know, everybody knows. We can shut our mouth, we can say anything, you know, but we know who is responsible. You even know who is responsible.
He was too scared to mention the name of President Mugabe. So you would say that it's not easy to talk about these things in Zimbabwe?
It's not easy. It's not easy because there are a handful of people who are enjoying the life, but the rest are not enjoying anything. So it's very hard.
Harare, the capital. We were advised to film only through our car's tinted windows. We immediately spotted more of what President Mugabe doesn't want the world to see. Long lines outside of a bank, shortages of everything. This man was desperate to unload his Zimbabwean dollars.
How much have you got?
20 million.
More and more, survival depends on a growing underground economy. But you won't find any of this in the daily newspapers. They've now been taken over by the ruling party. This is journalist Dumisani Malaya. He shows us the site of Zimbabwe's last independent daily paper. Its clashes with the government made it vulnerable to attack.
So the Daily News was within this building.
Can we stop here?
A bomb was dropped in this gallery there.
A bomb?
Yeah, a bomb was dropped. Apparently it was dropped by a car drove past this place at some breakneck speed. It dropped a bomb there. It hit the gallery.
Dumisani would only speak to us in the back seat of our car. He told me he'd been imprisoned twice for his reporting.
You know, the cells were packed. A cell designed for six people, you'll be pegged like sardines. In there, you'll be 35.
Journalists are routinely beaten and jailed. Dumisani is one of the few who will still tell the truth about Zimbabwe's epic collapse.
Zimbabwe is, without a doubt, the highest inflation in Africa, if not in the world. It has the weakest currency in Africa, if not in the world. You know, those kind of things. Really, that's why it becomes a big story. It is almost like it has now become a monumental museum of failure. The air is fraught with the frustration, with the anger, with the despair, and some people have just given up.
It wasn't supposed to be this way. Robert Mugabe was once a liberation hero, admired around the world. He ushered in prosperity, healthcare, and a literacy rate of 85%, the highest in Africa.
We are humanitarians. We don't want to see people killed.
But politics turned into thuggery, and holding on to power became Mugabe's top priority. In TV ads, the ruling ZANU-PF party openly threatened opponents.
This is one way to die. Don't commit suicide. Don't be foolish. Vote ZANU-PF and leave.
When the opposition nearly beat Mugabe in the 2000 elections, the president lashed back.
Lies! Lies and more lies!
Mugabe embarked on a radical land reform plan, violently seizing Zimbabwe's biggest farms, owned by whites, many of whom had funded the opposition. But instead of giving the farms to ordinary Zimbabweans, Mugabe handed them over to party loyalists and generals.
There's sort of hypocrisy. They've no feeling for any other person, for any human beings anymore. What they want is to make sure that how can they maintain their power base.
Margaret Dongo was a former ally of Mugabe and a famous freedom fighter. She was the first member of parliament to confront her colleagues in the ruling party.
I met them in banks, I met them in street, and I said, but guys, is this what we fought for? Honestly, why are you burying us alive? And they'll say, Margaret, you know, it's not our fault. It's about the big men. And the next question you ask, so why can't we have a change? Then they'll start stammering. You look at the country going down the drain, and you look at the time we took to build it up, and then one can just destroy it overnight. It's something painful.
Margaret Dongo's high profile makes it possible for her to speak out. But we know many of Mugabe's political opponents have been scared into silence. We drove south to the city of Bulawayo. Opposition to the ruling party runs deep here. President Mugabe stands accused of massacring some 20,000 people in this area early in his rule. Things looked worse in Bulawayo. Long lines around the block for food. We hid a camera in a backpack and went inside a supermarket to look around. The rest of the country was poor, but here the mainstay of the local diet, maize or cornmeal, was nowhere on the shelves. Outside of town, we find fields lying fallow. Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa, but land looted by the government produces little food. Now, we've heard, there's a new policy. The government is forcing poor family farmers to make up the shortfall. This woman told us the army had taken over her farm at gunpoint. She protested and was punished by a soldier. President Mugabe claims this new policy of farm takeovers will provide for the people. But on the outskirts of town, we discover bags of cornmeal being loaded onto government trucks. Few here, it seems, will eat any of it. The UN estimates nearly half the country, over 5 million Zimbabweans, will be in urgent need of food by the summer. We were taken to see a shop owner who spoke to us at great personal risk. She says the ruling party is using food as a political weapon.
People are now saying, we've been promised lies for quite a long time. We had all the hope and trusted these people were driving us the right way. Those are the ZANU-PF that are saying so. Now we have seen these people are playing foul out of us. ZANU-PF is just doing some havoc to the people.
Far removed from the suffering on the ground, President Mugabe recently celebrated his 82nd birthday.
Welcome to this special program, Reflections at 82.
He used state television to answer his critics.
Over 25 years of independence have brought Your Excellency more vilification and demonization from the West.
Sure.
Is there anything wrong with the man, Robert Mugabe?
I don't know. The judgment is that of others. The judgment is that of my people. My people say I am right in the things that I do, and that's what I listen to. Those who say I am wrong, I'm a dictator, if you look at them, I don't look nice to them, but I look nice and handsome to my people, isn't it?
But for most Zimbabweans, especially here in the south, President Mugabe's words ring hollow.
We are being muzzled by a government that has become hostile to its own people.
Archbishop Pius Ncube has become President Mugabe's most outspoken critic.
I've refused to be intimidated. I know many families that are spending 4 or 5 days without food. I parted with a lot of money, people coming here, women coming and crying before me. We haven't eaten for all these days. And to look around, sometimes I've even a lot of debts. I go borrowing money to help these people.
The Archbishop's sermons are monitored by government agents, and he's received death threats. But he hasn't softened his attack on President Mugabe.
He's a heartless person. How many people are suffering for this man? Hasn't he had enough power after 26 years. He should be ashamed enough to say, I've stayed long enough, I should get out and let other younger people come in who can do a better job than he.
What the Archbishop would tell us before we left would get less prominent Zimbabweans jailed.
What I pray for is that people become so restless and angry, and to get the army to their side and police to their side, and to stand up against him and bring him down.
In our top story tonight, 14 murder suspects appear before a Bulawayo court.
This is what happened to some men inspired by Archbishop Mugabe, who became active in the opposition.
In the gruesome killing.
In this extraordinary footage from Zimbabwean state television, the men are marched to an open grave, and local police force them to admit to the assassination of a ruling party member. A few days later, President Mugabe used the man's funeral to denounce the opposition before the nation.
Comrade Carlos' brutal murder was a bloody outcome of an orchestrated, much wider and carefully planned terrorist plot.
One of the accused opposition members, Kitani Sabanda, was arrested and imprisoned for 3 years without trial. We tracked him down in exile, and he told us his side of the story.
I was taken before cameras to make indications on a grave where there was a man buried there, a man that I never killed there. And I was made to proclaim before the nation that I was the murderer of that person.
Tortured into confessing, Kitani says his case was a classic example of what happens to those who oppose Robert Mugabe.
I was at one time raped by prisoners while prison officers washed off, and it was done by senior ranking prison officers. All this is acts of, intimidation and human degrading and just, tearing away the moral fiber within me.
Kitani fled to safety in South Africa, along with his fellow accused, Sazini Mpofu, seen here handcuffed to him on the right. But last year, Sazini made a bold move. He returned to Zimbabwe. We promised Kitani that we would try to find his friend, Sazini. And with leads from the opposition network, we finally tracked him down. He agreed to meet us at a safe location. We asked him why he risked his life to return home.
I came back because I felt I had to look after my young sisters and brothers. And I felt that if I was to stay out of the country, it would be like abandoning them.
Since Sazini was set up on this murder charge 5 years ago, the opposition has splintered. Now, Sazini says, the government remains largely unchallenged.
I think people, are no longer willing to fight because of what they've seen happening to other people and us. From Mugabe's point, actually the whole ZANU-PF group's point, I think they are telling themselves that they have won.
While Sazini was in prison, his house was burnt down by thugs loyal to the government. He's begun cautiously rebuilding it.
I might finish the place and then they come and burn it down again. So I'm still trying to see whether it's safe for everyone to come back home, or if it's not, then we have to abandon the place.
As most of the country struggles to survive, leaders of Zimbabwe's ruling party live in splendor behind high walls. And behind the biggest wall of all lies President Mugabe's newest palace, rumored to be the largest private residence in Africa. 3 acres of floor space, 25 bedrooms, marble from Italy, and roof tiles from Shanghai. Just down the road, we see unrelenting poverty. According to the World Health Organization, Zimbabwean women have the lowest life expectancy in the world, 34 years. About a year ago, Mugabe launched a campaign that he claimed would beautify the poor urban areas. But many say his real aim was to wipe out a breeding ground for opposition. Mugabe called this campaign Operation Murambachina, or Operation Clear Out the Filth. Footage of it was smuggled out of the country.
When the police came, we are just forced to push out.
They said you must take all your belongings within 30 minutes' time.
Police burnt and bulldozed thousands of homes and market stalls in towns around the country. Up to 700,000 people were made homeless, and millions lost their livelihood overnight. A year later, traces of these people remain, but no sign of the new homes Mugabe promised he'd build them. And more than a third of Zimbabwe's population has fled the country. In the last few years, Zimbabwe's troubles have spilled into neighbouring South Africa. Here in the capital, Johannesburg, we witnessed the local police trying to control this desperate scene.
Move it!
These Zimbabweans escaped President Mugabe's rule, and they don't want to go back. They will wait here all night to apply for political asylum. An exiled Zimbabwean journalist took cover behind our car.
There's pandemonium here, pushing and shoving because people are looking for asylum papers. But there's no system or there's no mechanism in place. They are rubber bullets, but they're shooting. I mean, the sound is actually gunshots.
For these Zimbabweans, a place in line represents survival. They know only a handful will ever be allowed to stay. In the last 5 years, over 2 million Zimbabweans have fled their homes for South Africa. Here, they've become a shadow population, eking out an existence in some of the poorest parts of the cities. The exiles look to the South African government to denounce President Mugabe and help bring about the end of his regime. But newspaper publisher Trevor Mugabe tells me this isn't likely.
South Africans don't know what to do with Robert Mugabe. The Americans don't have a clue how to deal with this man, apart from going in there and bombing him, which is not an option. They would want regime change yesterday, but how do you do it? How do you deal with a fallen hero like Robert Mugabe? A man that the whole of the continent has looked up to, a man that assisted the liberation of South Africa, for instance. How do you tell your father to shut up and sit down? Robert Mugabe, he's not getting out of power. He's made up his mind that he's going to drop dead in office.
As long as Mugabe stays, his people will continue to flee. At crowded deportation centres in South Africa, the unlucky ones are rounded up by the police and herded back to a country on its knees. In our time in Zimbabwe, we were lucky enough to have met those still willing to speak out. But their voices are growing harder to hear.
This is torture. This is torture.